In the whispered memories of desert winds, where golden sands hold secrets older than memory itself, there once flourished a realm that gleamed like the morning star against the endless Sahel. Here, beneath skies that stretched beyond the horizons, gentle curve, caravans moved like prayers across the vastness, carrying dreams wrapped in salt and gold. The empire of Wagadou, to those who knew her truest name, rose from earth that had drunk deep of ancient rivers and witnessed the footsteps of kings whose crowns caught fire from the setting sun. In this land where silence speaks louder than thunder, where the very stones remember stories of power and glory, we begin our journey into a world where traders were princes and gold was more precious than water, where the echoes of a magnificent civilization still dance on the evening breeze, waiting to tell their tales to those who listen with the heart of a dreamer. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours, in the heart of West Africa, where the great Niger River bends like a shepherd's crook through landscapes painted in shades of gold and amber. There existed a land that would become the cradle of one of Africa's most magnificent empires. This was the Sahel, that delicate threshold between the Sahara's endless dunes and the verdant forests of the south. A place where two worlds met and whispered their secrets to those who knew how to listen. The Sahel breathed with the rhythm of seasons, expanding and contracting like a living thing. During the gentle rains, when the sky opened its generous hands, the grasslands would bloom in cascades of green that rolled like ocean waves toward every horizon. Scattered acacias stood like ancient sentinels, their thorned branches offering precious shade to travelers and their livestock, while beneath their canopy, the earth yielded its bounty to those who understood its moods. As the seasons turned, and the rains withdrew into the southern forests, the Sahel would transform itself into something altogether different. The grasses would fade to the color of honey, then to the deep gold of ripened grain, until finally they whispered dry songs in the harmattan winds that swept down from the north. It was during these dry months that the land revealed its most precious secret, the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the kingdoms of the forest. Pathways that would become the arteries through which the lifeblood of Ghana would flow, long before the first stone was laid in what would become the empire's great cities. This land was home to peoples who had learned to read the subtle language of the Sahel's seasons. The Soninke, whose name would become synonymous with the empire's glory, were among these early inhabitants, farmers and herders who had spent generations perfecting the delicate art of survival in this marginal landscape. They were a people shaped by paradox, like the land itself, strong enough to endure the harsh dry seasons when the harmattan winds scoured the earth clean, yet gentle enough to coax life from soil that seemed to hold more sand than substance. They understood that true wealth came not from forcing the land to yield, but from learning to dance with its rhythms, to take what it offered freely while giving back what it needed to flourish. The Soninke villages dotted the landscape like islands of human warmth in an ocean of grass and scattered trees. Each settlement was a small miracle of adaptation, its round houses built from the very earth upon which they stood, their walls plastered smooth with clay that had been mixed with care and blessed by generations of hands. The granaries, raised on stilts like proud birds, held the community's most precious treasure, the millet, sorghum, and other grains that would sustain life through the long months when the rains forgot to come in these villages. Children learned the old stories around fires that crackled with dried grass and thorny branches, their faces lit by flames that danced with the shadows of their ancestors. They heard tales of spirits that lived in the great baobab trees, of rivers that could speak to those who knew the right words, of distant lands where salt was as white as clouds and gold lay hidden in the earth like sleeping stars. It was among these people, in this land of subtle beauty and harsh demands, that the seeds of empire were first planted, not in conquest or dominion, but in the simple recognition that their position at the crossroads of Africa's great natural highways was a gift that could be transformed into something magnificent. They began to understand that the caravans that occasionally passed through their territory were not merely travelers, but lifelines connecting worlds that had never known each other existed. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the way the first rains of the season seep into parched earth. Soninke farmers began to produce surplus crops, not just for their own security, but to trade with the passing caravans. They learned that the dried meat from their cattle and goats was prized by merchants, who had been traveling for weeks through lands where game was scarce. Their pottery, shaped by skilled hands that had learned the craft from mothers and grandmothers stretching back through countless generations, found eager buyers among traders who needed vessels that could withstand the rigors of long journeys. But it was the discovery of gold that would change everything, transforming the quiet Soninke settlements from subsistence communities into the foundation stones of what would become one of Africa's greatest empires. The gold was not found in their own lands, but in the rivers and streams of the forest regions far to the south, where other peoples had learned to pan the precious metal from sand and gravel deposits left by countless seasons of flooding. The Soninke, with their strategic position between the gold fields of the south and the salt mines of the north, found themselves uniquely positioned to become the middlemen in a trade that would reshape the entire region. They learned that the salt, which was as common as sand in the northern reaches of the Sahara, was worth its weight in gold to the forest peoples who had no access to this precious preservative and its flavor enhancer. And so began the Great Transformation, as individual Soninke traders began to organize larger and more complex expeditions, establishing networks of trust and mutual obligation that would eventually span thousands of miles. They learned to read the subtle signs that marked safe passage through the desert, to negotiate with Berber guides who knew the hidden wells that meant the difference between life and death, to maintain relationships with southern kingdoms whose forests held treasures beyond imagination. The wealth that began to flow through Soninke lands was unlike anything their ancestors had ever imagined. Gold dust, measured out in tiny brass weights that were themselves works of art, began to accumulate in quantities that defied belief. Salt blocks, hard as stone and white as fresh milk, were stacked in warehouses like monuments to human ingenuity. Copper ornaments, fine textiles, and exotic goods from distant lands began to appear in markets that had once known only the simple exchange of grain for livestock. With wealth came complexity, and with complexity came the need for new forms of organization. The informal networks of kinship and mutual obligation that had sufficed for small farming communities proved inadequate to manage the intricate web of relationships that trade required. Leaders emerged who could command respect not just from their own clans, but from the diverse array of peoples who were beginning to converge on Soninke territories. These leaders were not kings in the sense that would later emerge, but rather skilled negotiators and organizers who could maintain the delicate balance of relationships that kept the trade flowing. They had to be diplomats who could speak with Arab merchants from the north, warriors who could protect their people from raiders who sought to steal their growing wealth, and administrators who could manage the complex logistics of moving goods across vast distances through difficult terrain. As the trade grew more complex and the stakes higher, these leaders began to formalize their authority, establishing institutions that could outlast individual personalities and create the stability that merchants needed to make long-term investments in trade relationships. They created systems of weights and measures that could be trusted across cultural boundaries, established procedures for resolving disputes that might otherwise escalate into violence, and developed the diplomatic protocols that would allow them to negotiate as equals with the established powers of North Africa. The land itself began to change as well, as the growing wealth attracted not just merchants but also craftsmen, scholars, and ambitious individuals from across West Africa who sensed that something remarkable was taking shape in the Sahel. New settlements grew up around the most important crossroads, their populations swelling with people who brought new skills, new ideas, and new connections to distant lands. These emerging urban centers were unlike anything the region had seen before. They were cosmopolitan places where languages mixed and mingled like streams converging into a great river, where the call to prayer echoed alongside the chanting of traditional priests, where the architecture began to reflect influences from across the known world. The simple round houses of the traditional villages gave way to more elaborate structures built from fired brick and stone, their walls decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of wealth and sophistication. Markets became not just places of exchange, but centers of learning and cultural innovation. Merchants from different continents shared not just goods but knowledge, stories, and techniques that would enrich the growing civilization in ways that went far beyond material wealth. The art of writing, brought by Muslim traders from the north, began to supplement the rich oral traditions of the Soninke, creating new possibilities for record-keeping, literature, and the preservation of knowledge. Yet for all the changes that trade brought, the fundamental character of the Soninke people remained rooted in their deep connection to the land, and their understanding of the delicate balance required to thrive in the Sahel. They remained farmers and herders at heart, people who understood that true wealth lay not in accumulation but in the ability to sustain life through the cycles of abundance and scarcity that defined their world. This wisdom would prove invaluable as they faced the challenges of empire building. Unlike conquerors who sought to impose their will through force, the Soninke leaders understood that lasting power came from creating systems that benefited all participants, that drew strength from diversity rather than demanding conformity, and that remained flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. In the deepest layers of memory, where history dissolves into legend and legend becomes truth, the Soninke people preserved stories that spoke of their origins in language that transcended the merely factual. These were not histories in the modern sense, but rather spiritual maps that guided their understanding of who they were, and why they had been chosen to occupy this crucial position at the crossroads of Africa. The Griots, those masterful keepers of oral tradition whose voices could weave spells from the raw material of human experience, spoke of times when the world was younger and the boundaries between the seen and unseen were more porous. They told of ancestors who had walked with spirits, of kings whose power came not from armies alone but from their ability to commune with the forces that governed the natural world, of a time when the very landscape responded to the will of those who ruled with wisdom and justice. According to these ancient chronicles, the land that would become Ghana was not always the crossroads of trade that it later became. There had been earlier kingdoms, earlier experiments in human organization that had risen and fallen like the seasonal floods of the Niger River. Some had been destroyed by their own excess, others by external enemies, still others by the simple passage of time that wears down even the strongest foundations. But from each failure, the Griots insisted, wisdom had been preserved and passed down to those who would come after. The collapse of earlier kingdoms had not been meaningless disasters, but rather necessary lessons in the education of a people who were being prepared for something greater. Each generation learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, developing more sophisticated understanding of how to balance the competing demands of wealth and justice, power and responsibility, tradition and innovation. The archaeological evidence, while more fragmentary than the grand narratives of the Griots, supported at least the broad outlines of these traditional accounts. Throughout the region, scattered across the landscape like pieces of a vast puzzle, researchers have found evidence of human settlement stretching back thousands of years. Stone tools, pottery fragments, and the remains of ancient settlements tell a story of gradual development, of communities that grew more complex and sophisticated over many centuries. The transition from the late Stone Age to the Iron Age in this region appears to have been particularly significant, marking not just a technological advancement, but a fundamental shift in how people related to their environment and to each other. The ability to work iron opened new possibilities for agriculture, allowing for more efficient clearing of land and the development of better tools for cultivation. It also revolutionized warfare and hunting, giving those who mastered the technology significant advantages over their neighbors. But perhaps most importantly, iron technology required new forms of social organization. The mining of iron ore, the construction and maintenance of furnaces, the complex processes of smelting and forging, all of these activities demanded levels of cooperation and specialization that went far beyond what was possible in simple farming communities. Master craftsmen emerged who commanded respect and resources commensurate with their crucial skills, while the communities that could support such specialists found themselves with significant advantages in both peace and war. The Soninke positioned, as they were in a region rich in iron ore deposits, were among the early masters of this transformative technology. Their smiths became renowned throughout the region for the quality of their work, creating not just tools and weapons, but also the ceremonial objects that marked status and authority in their increasingly complex society. The forge became a sacred space, where the transformation of raw ore into useful metal was understood as a kind of magical process that paralleled the transformation of human communities from simple kinship groups into more sophisticated political entities. Iron technology spread and trade networks expanded. The Soninke found themselves increasingly connected to developments across a vast region. Innovations that emerged hundreds of miles away could reach them within a few seasons, while their own discoveries spread outward along the same networks that brought them new ideas and technologies. This process of cultural exchange and technological diffusion created a dynamic environment where change was constant and adaptation essential for survival. The introduction of new crops from distant regions exemplified this process of beneficial exchange. Crops that had been developed in other parts of Africa, or even in distant continents, gradually made their way into Soninke agricultural systems, providing new sources of nutrition and greater security against crop failures. The banana, probably originating in Southeast Asia, appeared in West African markets. New varieties of yams, millet, and sorghum, each adapted to slightly different environmental conditions, gave farmers more options for managing the risks inherent in agriculture. In the marginal lands of the Sahel, domestic animals, too, were part of this great exchange. Cattle, sheep, and goats had been part of West African pastoral systems for millennia, but new breeds and better management techniques continued to arrive along the trade routes. The horse, which would later become so important in the military organization of the Ghana Empire, was probably introduced from North Africa during this period, along with the knowledge of how to breed and train these magnificent animals for both warfare and transportation. But it was the camel that represented perhaps the most revolutionary development in the long history of trans-Saharan connections. These remarkable animals, with their ability to travel for days without water and to carry heavy loads across terrain that would defeat any other beast of burden, transformed the Sahara from a nearly impassable barrier into a highway connecting the Mediterranean world with sub-Saharan Africa. The impact of the camel's introduction cannot be overstated. What had previously been occasional, dangerous, and extremely expensive contact between North and West Africa became regular, reliable, and profitable trade. Merchants who had previously been limited to the edges of the desert could now venture deep into its heart, following routes that connected oases and way stations in a network that spanned the entire width of the Sahara. For the Soninke positioned at the southern terminus of these new trade routes, the camel revolution represented an unprecedented opportunity. They were ideally located to serve as intermediaries between the established civilizations of the Mediterranean and the rich resources of West Africa. Their territory became a crucial staging area where northbound caravans could rest, resupply, and reorganize before undertaking the dangerous journey across the desert, while southbound traders could prepare for the different challenges they would face in the forests and savannas beyond the Sahel. The wealth that began to flow through Soninke lands as a result of this expanded trade was transformative, but it also brought new challenges and responsibilities. Success in trade required not just the ability to produce goods that others wanted, but also the capacity to provide security, reliability, and fair dealing that would encourage merchants to return again and again. This meant developing legal systems that could handle disputes between people from different cultures, diplomatic protocols for dealing with foreign powers, and military capabilities sufficient to protect the trade routes from bandits and raiders. Soninke's response to these challenges was characteristically practical and adaptive. Rather than trying to impose a single rigid system across their increasingly diverse territory, they developed flexible approaches that could accommodate different peoples and different needs, while maintaining the essential stability that trade required. Local communities retained much of their traditional autonomy, but within a framework that ensured consistency in those areas' security, weights and measures, dispute resolution that were crucial for commercial success. This pragmatic approach to governance would become one of the defining characteristics of the Ghana Empire as it emerged from these early foundations. Unlike some other ancient empires that were built primarily through military conquest and maintained through coercion, Ghana developed as a commercial enterprise that succeeded by making itself indispensable to the economic life of the region. Its power rested not on the ability to force compliance, but on the capacity to provide services that everyone needed, and to do so more efficiently and reliably than any alternative. The transformation of Soninke society during this period was gradual but profound. Traditional patterns of life, farming, herding, craftsmanship continued, but they were increasingly integrated into larger systems of production and exchange. Young people who might once have been content to follow in their parents' footsteps found themselves drawn to new opportunities in trade, administration, and the military. Social hierarchies became more complex as new forms of wealth and status emerged alongside traditional measures of success and prestige. Yet throughout this period of rapid change, the Soninke maintained their essential character as a people deeply rooted in the land and committed to the values of reciprocity and mutual obligation that had enabled their ancestors to survive in the challenging environment of the Sahel. These values would prove to be crucial assets as they faced the even greater challenges of building and maintaining an empire that would endure for centuries and leave its mark on the entire African continent. The stage was set for the emergence of leaders who could transform these scattered communities and their growing commercial networks into something unprecedented in the history of West Africa's centralized empire that could command respect from the great powers of the medieval world while remaining true to the values and traditions that had shaped its people through countless generations of struggle and adaptation in the lands between the rivers. From the depths of Soninke, collective memory emerges a figure whose story bridges the gap between history and myth, between the world of ordinary mortals and the realm of destiny itself. Dinga, known also as Dinkasis, represents far more than a historical personage. He embodies the spiritual and cultural foundations upon which the Ghana Empire would rise. A figure whose legendary journey from the mysterious East would establish the principles and precedents that would guide the empire for centuries to come. The Griots tell us that Dinga came from the East, from lands that lay beyond the horizon of ordinary knowledge. Some traditions place his origins in the ancient kingdom of Aswan, along the life-giving waters of the Nile, where the wisdom of Egypt's pharaohs still echoed in stone temples and hieroglyphic inscriptions. Others speak more vaguely of distant lands where the sun first touches the earth each morning, places where knowledge and power were ancient when the world was young. But the geographical details of Dinga's origins matter less than what his journey from east to west represents in the deeper logic of Soninke tradition. The East was the direction of beginnings, of knowledge, of divine inspiration. To come from the East was to carry with one the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had mastered the arts of governance, of justice, of the delicate balance between human ambition and divine will. Dinga's westward journey was thus not merely a migration but a transmission of sacred knowledge to a people who had been prepared by their ancestors to receive and preserve it. The circumstances of Dinga's arrival in the land of the Soninke are wreathed in mystery and miracle. Some accounts describe him as a warrior king who had been driven from his ancestral lands by enemies too powerful to resist. Others portray him as a wise man who had received a divine vision, commanding him to travel westward until he found the place where his destiny awaited. Still others suggest that he was guided by supernatural forces, perhaps the spirits of his ancestors or the gods themselves, who had chosen him to establish a new kingdom in the heart of West Africa. What all accounts agree upon is that Dinga did not arrive empty-handed. He brought with him knowledge of statecraft and governance that was far more sophisticated than anything the Soninke had previously known. He understood the principles of legitimate authority, the ways in which power could be exercised without destroying the foundations upon which it rested. He knew the secrets of diplomacy and negotiation, the arts of war and peace, the methods by which diverse peoples could be united without losing their essential character. But perhaps most importantly, Dinga brought with him a vision of what the Soninke people could become if they were willing to embrace their destiny as rulers of the crossroads between worlds. He saw in their strategic position, their practical wisdom, and their deep connection to the land the raw materials from which a great empire could be built. He understood that their success would depend not on conquest alone but on their ability to create systems of governance that would serve the needs of all the peoples who came within their sphere of influence. The story of how Dinga established his authority among the Soninke reveals much about the nature of leadership in their society, Unlike conquerors who imposed their will through force, Dinga had to prove his worth through wisdom, through his ability to solve problems that had long plagued the scattered communities of the region. The Griots tell of his intervention in disputes that had divided communities for generations, of his establishment of new trade relationships that brought prosperity to previously isolated settlements, of his introduction of new technologies and techniques that improved the lives of ordinary people. One of the most significant of Dinga's innovations was the establishment of formal diplomatic relationships with neighboring peoples and distant kingdoms. Where previous leaders had been content to deal with immediate neighbors and occasional trading partners, Dinga understood that lasting prosperity required a broader vision. He sent emissaries to the great kingdoms of the north, establishing the Ghana Empire's first formal diplomatic presence in the wider world. He negotiated treaties with southern peoples who controlled access to the goldfields, creating the stable relationships that would become the foundation of Ghana's later wealth. Dinga's approach to governance was characterized by a careful balance between innovation and respect for tradition. He did not attempt to sweep away the existing social order, but rather to build upon its strengths while addressing its weaknesses. Traditional chiefs and elders retained their authority within their own communities, but within a larger framework that provided coordination and mutual support. New institutions were created to handle the expanding needs of trade and diplomacy, but they were staffed with people who understood and respected the values and customs of the Soninke people. The military innovations introduced during Dinga's reign would prove to be particularly significant for the future development of the empire. He recognized that the growing wealth of the Soninke territories would inevitably attract the attention of less fortunate neighbors who might be tempted to take by force what they could not earn through trade. At the same time, he understood that purely defensive strategies would not be sufficient to protect the far-flung trade routes upon which the prosperity of his people depended. Dinga's solution was to create a military organization that combined the traditional warrior traditions of the Soninke with new technologies and tactics, learned from his contacts with other civilizations. He introduced the use of iron weapons and armor on a larger scale than had been possible before, taking advantage of the skilled metalworkers who had long been part of Soninke society. He established training programs that created a core of professional soldiers who could serve as the backbone of larger forces recruited from the general population when needed. But perhaps most importantly, Dinga understood that military strength was most effective when it was rarely used. He developed diplomatic and economic strategies that made potential enemies into allies, creating a network of relationships that provided security through mutual advantage rather than through fear alone. The reputation of Soninke military prowess served to deter aggression, while the benefits of peaceful cooperation provided positive incentives for maintaining good relationships. The religious and spiritual dimensions of Dinga's reign were equally significant, though they are perhaps the most difficult aspects of his legacy to understand from a modern perspective. The Soninke had their own ancient religious traditions, centered around the worship of ancestors and the spirits of the natural world. These traditions provided social cohesion and moral guidance, but they were primarily local in scope, tied to specific places and communities. Dinga appears to have understood that the expanded scale of the political and economic systems he was creating would require religious and spiritual frameworks that could transcend local boundaries while still respecting local traditions. He did not attempt to replace existing beliefs, but rather to create overarching spiritual concepts that could unite diverse peoples, while allowing them to maintain their distinctive practices and customs. The concept of divine kingship that became central to Ghana's political system seems to have emerged during this period. Dinga and his successors were not merely political leaders, but sacred figures whose authority derived ultimately from their special relationship with the spiritual forces that governed the world. This was not absolute power in the modern sense, but rather a form of leadership that was hedged about with sacred obligations and responsibilities. The king's authority was legitimate only as long as he fulfilled his duties to his people and maintained the proper relationships with the ancestors and spirits who watched over the land. The economic policies established during Dinga's reign laid the foundations for the prosperity that would characterize the Ghana Empire for centuries to come. He understood that sustainable wealth could not be based on exploitation or extraction alone, but required the creation of systems that benefited all participants. The tax system that he established was designed to generate revenue for the government, while encouraging rather than discouraging trade and production. Merchants were required to pay fees for the use of trade routes and markets, but these fees were reasonable and were applied consistently regardless of the merchant's origin or destination. More importantly, the services provided in exchange for these fees were genuinely valuable. The government maintained the roads and ensured the security of the trade routes. It provided standardized weights and measures that made trade more efficient and reliable. It established courts that could resolve disputes fairly and quickly, without the delays and uncertainties that had previously plagued commercial relationships. It maintained diplomatic relationships that opened new markets and opportunities for Soninke merchants and craftsmen. The cultural policies of Dinga's reign were equally far-sighted. He recognized that the increasing diversity of the population, as traders and immigrants from distant lands were attracted to the growing prosperity of Soninke territories, could be either a source of strength or a cause of conflict, depending on how it was managed. His approach was to encourage cultural exchange while maintaining the essential stability that came from shared values and common purposes. New arrivals were welcomed and encouraged to contribute their skills and knowledge to the common enterprise. But they were also expected to respect the customs and traditions of their hosts. Intermarriage between different groups was common and was generally encouraged as a way of creating personal bonds that could transcend cultural differences. The children of such marriages often became particularly valuable as interpreters and intermediaries who could facilitate communication and understanding between different communities. The legal system that emerged during this period reflected this pragmatic approach to diversity. Rather than attempting to impose a single code of law across all communities, the system allowed different groups to maintain their own customary laws in matters that affected only their own members, but in areas that involved relationships between different groups, trade, marriage, property rights, criminal offenses. Common standards were established that applied to everyone regardless of their background. As Dinga's reign drew to a close, the foundations of what would become the Ghana Empire were firmly established. The scattered communities of the Sahel had been united under a common leadership that respected their diversity, while providing the coordination and mutual support that enabled them to prosper in an increasingly complex world. The trade networks that would bring unprecedented wealth to the region were functioning smoothly, protected by military forces that were strong enough to deter aggression while being restrained enough to avoid provoking unnecessary conflicts. The diplomatic relationships that connected the emerging empire to the wider world were based on mutual respect and advantage rather than domination or exploitation. The religious and spiritual foundations of the society had been strengthened and expanded too. accommodate the needs of a more diverse and complex population. The legal and administrative systems had been modernized while maintaining their essential character as expressions of Soninke values and traditions. But perhaps most importantly, Dinga had established precedents and principles that would guide his successors through the challenges that lay ahead. He had shown that it was possible to build a great empire without destroying the values and traditions that gave it meaning and legitimacy. He had demonstrated that military strength was most effective when it was combined with diplomatic skill and economic opportunity. He had proven that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness, if it was managed with wisdom and restraint. The death of Dinga marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in the story of the Ghana Empire. The institutions he had created would continue to evolve and adapt to new challenges and opportunities. The values he had embodied would continue to guide the decisions of future generations of leaders. The vision he had articulated of a great African empire that could command respect throughout the known world would continue to inspire the efforts of those who came after him. As the torch of leadership passed to a new generation, the foundations that Dinga had laid would prove their strength and flexibility. The empire he had begun to build would grow and prosper, becoming one of the most remarkable political and economic achievements in the history of medieval Africa. But the principles he had established, respect for diversity, commitment to justice, understanding of the reciprocal obligations that bind rulers and ruled, would remain constant throughout the long centuries of Ghana's greatness. A testament to the wisdom and vision of the legendary founder who had traveled from the distant east to establish a kingdom in the heart of West Africa. Through the generations that followed Diaby's triumph, the sons and daughters of Wagadou learned to read the desert's moods like ancient scripture. They understood that power lay not in the gold beneath their feet, but in the patient art of standing between desire and fulfillment. The empire that would come to be known as Ghana grew not through conquest alone, but through the subtle mastery of making themselves indispensable to the dreams of distant peoples. In the 8th century of the Christian era, when the morning star still bore witness to caravans that moved like prayers across the dunes, the Sis dynasty had established itself as the beating heart of West African trade. Kaya Megansis, whose name meant ruler of gold, understood that true wealth flowed not from possessing the precious metal, but from controlling its passage to those who hungered for it most deeply. The Soninke people, under the guidance of their Ghana, their war chief and protector, had transformed their homeland into something unprecedented in the region. Where once scattered villages had dotted the landscape like islands in a vast sea of grass and sand, now a network of settlements stretched across the savannah, connected by paths worn smooth by countless feet and hooves. The capital, they called home, had two names, reflecting its dual nature. To the Soninke it was simply Ghana, the place of the king. To the Arab merchants who increasingly made their way southward, it became Koumbi, Saleh, the city of prosperity. The genius of Ghana rulers lay in their understanding that empires are built not of stone and mortar, but of relationships and mutual dependence. Unlike the great kingdoms that rose through military might alone, Wagadou grew strong by making itself the bridge between worlds that barely knew of each other's existence. To the north, beyond the seemingly endless expanse of the Sahara, lay the lands of the Maghreb, and beyond them, the Mediterranean civilizations that had long coveted the yellow metal that symbolized eternity and divine favor. To the south and east, in the forested regions where the Niger River carved its ancient path through the landscape, lay the goldfields that would fuel an empire's dreams. The people of Bambouk and Bua, working in harmony with streams and earth, had discovered the art of coaxing gold from hidden places. Yet they remained largely isolated from the great currents of long-distance trade, their wealth hidden like seeds waiting for spring between these two worlds. The rulers of Ghana positioned themselves with the patience of master craftsmen. They did not seek to control the sources of gold directly. Such an approach would have required military campaigns across vast distances and against peoples who knew their own lands intimately. Instead, they created something far more valuable: a system of trust, security, and mutual benefit that made their capital the inevitable crossroads of continental commerce. The Ghanaian approach to empire building reflected a profound understanding of human nature and economic necessity. Rather than demanding tribute through force alone, they offered services that merchants and traders could not easily obtain elsewhere: safe passage through their territories, protection from bandits and hostile tribes, reliable sources of food and water, and above all, a legal framework that ensured contracts would be honored and disputes resolved fairly. Under Bassi's successors, this system matured into something approaching administrative art. The empire developed a complex network of officials, each responsible for different aspects of the trade that sustained their civilization. There were inspectors who certified the quality of goods, judges who settled commercial disputes, and military commanders who ensured that the trade routes remained secure. Tax collectors, trained in the delicate art of extracting revenue without strangling commerce, established rates that merchants grudgingly accepted as the price of doing business in safety. The most ingenious aspect of Ghana's economic policy lay in their approach to gold taxation, understanding that merchants needed to feel they retained some control over their transactions. The Ghana decreed that while all gold nuggets belonged to the crown, gold dust could be freely traded. This served multiple purposes. It prevented the market from being flooded with large quantities of gold that might depress prices. It ensured a steady stream of revenue for the royal treasury, and it maintained the metal's mystique and value. In distant markets, by the 9th century, this system had created unprecedented prosperity across the region. Koumbi Saleh had grown from a modest royal settlement into one of the largest cities in Africa, its population swelling with merchants, craftsmen, Islamic scholars, and administrators drawn by the opportunities that flowed like golden rivers. Through its streets, al-Bakri, the learned geographer of Cordoba, would later describe Koumbi Saleh as a marvel of urban planning, though his account reflects the perspective of a scholar writing from a distant land about places he had never seen. According to his sources, merchants and travelers who had witnessed the city's grandeur firsthand, the capital of Ghana was essentially two cities separated by several miles, each serving distinct functions in the empire's complex social and economic structure. The royal city, where the Ghana held court, stood as a testament to indigenous African architectural achievement. Here, traditional Soninke building techniques had evolved over centuries to accommodate the needs of imperial administration. The palace complex sprawled across several acres, its walls built of the red clay and stone that characterized the region's construction methods. Within these walls, the Ghana maintained apartments for his wives, quarters for his children and the sons of vassal kings who came to learn statecraft, and audience halls where the business of empire was conducted. The king's dwelling place reflected both the practical needs of governance and the spiritual responsibilities that came with power. Sacred groves surrounded portions of the complex, where the traditional priests maintained their communion with the ancestral spirits and the natural forces that the Soninke believed governed the success or failure of human enterprises. These holy places remained largely hidden from foreign visitors, maintaining the mystery and spiritual authority that complemented the Ghanar's political power. The second city, built to accommodate the growing community of Muslim merchants and administrators, represented Ghanar's remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning their core identity. As trade with North Africa intensified, increasing numbers of Arab and Berber merchants began establishing permanent residences in the capital rather than simply passing through on seasonal trading expeditions. These foreigners brought with them not only goods and capital, but also new ideas about law, administration, and urban planning. Rather than attempting to force these newcomers to abandon their religious and cultural practices, the Ghanaian authorities demonstrated a pragmatic tolerance that served their empire well. The merchant quarter was allowed to develop according to Islamic urban principles, with its great mosque serving as both a place of worship and a center for commercial negotiations. Islamic judges, versed in the complex commercial law that governed long-distance trade, were permitted to settle disputes between Muslim merchants according to their own legal traditions. This arrangement benefited all parties involved. The foreign merchants gained a secure base of operations and the comfort of familiar religious and legal institutions. The Ghanaian administration gained access to sophisticated commercial practices, diplomatic connections with other Islamic states, and increased tax revenue from expanded trade. Most importantly, the system allowed for cultural exchange without forced conversion or the abandonment of traditional practices. The architectural contrast between the two cities reflected their different purposes and populations. The royal city maintained the horizontal emphasis characteristic of Sudanic architecture, with its low buildings spreading outward rather than upward, creating courtyards and open spaces that facilitated both ceremony and the practical business of administration. The building materials, clay, stone, and timber, were drawn from local sources, and the decorative elements reflected traditional Soninke artistic traditions. The merchant city, by contrast, showed clear influences from North African urban design. Buildings rose higher, with flat roofs suitable for the region's climate, and the street plan followed the more geometric patterns favored in Islamic cities. The Great Mosque, built in the distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style that would become characteristic of the region, featured the towering minaret and large prayer hall necessary to accommodate the growing Muslim population. Trade flowed between these to cities like blood through the arteries of a living body. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen above the eastern horizon, merchants would begin the journey from their quarters to the markets that lay between the two settlements. Caravans arriving from the north would discharge their precious cargoes of salt, horses, manufactured goods, and books, while those preparing to depart southward would take on supplies of gold, ivory, slaves, and the exotic products that made the arduous journey across the desert profitable. The success of Ghanar's commercial empire rested upon its mastery of what modern scholars call the silent trade, a system of exchange so refined and ritualized that it allowed peoples who shared no common language or cultural understanding to conduct business safely and profitably. This ancient practice, described with wonder by Arab geographers, represented one of humanity's most elegant solutions to the challenges of long-distance commerce in an age before international law or standardized currency. In the goldfields, too, the south of Ghanar's heartland, this silent trade unfolded according to patterns established over countless generations. Northern merchants, having traveled for weeks across desert and savanna, would arrive at predetermined locations along rivers where gold was known to be available. There, they would arrange their good salt, cloth, metal tools, horses in neat piles, each representing what they hoped to exchange for a specific quantity of gold. Having arranged their merchandise, the northern traders would withdraw to agreed-upon distances, sometimes climbing hills or crossing rivers to ensure they could not be seen by the local gold producers. They would then signal their presence through prescribed methods: drum beats, smoke signals, or the calling of specific animal sounds. Wait in patient silence for a response. The local people, alerted to the merchant's arrival, would emerge from their concealment to examine the offered goods. If the exchange seemed favorable, they would place quantities of gold dust or small nuggets beside each pile of merchandise, then withdraw in turn to allow the traders to examine what had been offered. This process might continue for days, with both sides adjusting their offers until a mutually satisfactory arrangement was reached. Only when both parties were satisfied would the actual exchange take place, often marked by ritual gestures or ceremonial acknowledgements that sealed the bargain according to traditions both sides understood and respected. The system worked because it was based on mutual benefit and long-term relationships rather than single transactions. Merchants who cheated or attempted to violate the established protocols would find themselves excluded from future trading opportunities, while those who dealt fairly earned reputations that opened doors throughout the region. Ghana's rulers understood that their empire's prosperity depended upon maintaining and protecting this delicate system. They positioned military outposts at strategic points along the trade routes, not to control the trade directly, but to ensure that it could proceed without interference from bandits, raiders, or other disruptive forces. They established rest stations where travelers could find food, water, and secure storage for their goods. Most importantly, they created a legal framework that gave merchants confidence that contracts would be honored and disputes resolved fairly. The taxation system that supported the imperial administration reflected this same careful balance between extraction and encouragement. Rather than imposing crippling levies that would drive trade elsewhere, Ghana's officials collected modest but consistent fees on imports and exports. A trader bringing salt into the empire paid 1 gold dinar in tax. When exporting that same salt, he paid to diners. These rates, while significant, were not so high as to make trade unprofitable, and the services provided security, legal protection, market facilities justified the expense in the minds of most merchants. The genius of this system became apparent in its effects on regional development. As trade volumes increased, so did the resources available to the imperial administration. These resources were reinvested in infrastructure: better roads, more secure storage facilities, expanded military protection, which attracted additional trade, creating a virtuous cycle of growth and prosperity. The wealth generated by commerce allowed the Ghana to maintain the diplomatic relationships and military strength necessary to keep the trade routes open and secure. By the 10th century, Ghana had become the indispensable hub of West African commerce. Merchants from as far away as Egypt and the Mediterranean regions planned their expeditions around the seasons when trade was most active in Koumbi, Saleh. The city's markets offered goods from across the known world: North African horses and textiles, Mediterranean glassware and jewelry, Middle Eastern spices and perfumes, and the exotic products of tropical Africa: ivory, exotic woods, precious stones, and above all, the gold that had made Ghana's reputation throughout the civilized world, the wealth flowing through Ghana's markets supported not only the royal court and military, but also a growing class of artisans, scholars, and administrators whose skills and knowledge enhanced the empire's capabilities. Local craftsmen learned to work with imported materials, creating distinctive artistic styles that blended traditional African techniques with influences from across the trade networks. Islamic scholars established schools and libraries that preserved and transmitted knowledge from across the Muslim world, while also studying and documenting local traditions and practices. Within the walls of the royal city, the Ghana maintained a court that reflected both the ancient traditions of Soninke kingship and the cosmopolitan influences of an empire that touched 3 continents. Each morning, as the sun crested the eastern horizon and painted the clay walls golden, the business of ruling an empire began with ceremonies that had been refined over centuries of imperial administration. The Ghana himself, for the title, was both personal name and royal office, appeared before his subjects, dressed in garments that proclaimed his status as mediator between the earthly and spiritual realms. Gold adorned his person in carefully prescribed ways. Golden bracelets that caught the morning light, a golden cap that identified him as the keeper of his people's prosperity, and a golden sword that symbolized his authority to enforce justice and maintain order. Around his neck hung amulets and talismans that connected him to the ancestral spirits and protective forces that Soninke tradition held responsible for the empire's success. The court ceremony that began each day of imperial business reflected Ghana's unique position as a bridge between different worlds and different ways of understanding power and authority. Traditional Soninke nobles, their authority derived from ancient bloodlines and clan relationships, took their places according to protocols established long before the empire had grown to its current size and complexity. Alongside them stood administrators and advisors, whose positions reflected their expertise in the new challenges of governing a cosmopolitan empire. Islamic judges versed in commercial law, military commanders responsible for protecting trade routes that stretched across thousands of miles, and diplomatic representatives from vassal states and allied kingdoms. The Ghana's daily routine reflected the careful balance required to maintain authority over such a diverse empire. Morning audiences were devoted primarily to traditional matters, settling disputes between local communities, receiving reports from provincial governors, and maintaining the spiritual relationships that Soninke tradition held essential to the empire's welfare. The sacred groves surrounding the palace complex required regular attention, and the Ghana participated personally in rituals designed to ensure the favor of ancestral spirits and natural forces as the day progressed. The focus of court business shifted toward the commercial and diplomatic challenges of imperial administration. Merchants seeking resolution of trade disputes presented their cases before judges who combined traditional Soninke concepts of justice with the more complex legal principles required by international commerce. Tax collectors reported on revenues from different regions and trade routes, allowing the administration to adjust policies in response to changing economic conditions. Foreign diplomats, representing kingdoms and trading cities from across North and West Africa, sought audiences to negotiate treaties, settle boundary disputes, or arrange the complex diplomatic marriages that bound the empire's diverse territories together. The Ghana's court had become a center of international diplomacy, where representatives of different cultures and religions found common ground in their shared interest in maintaining the stability and prosperity that made long-distance trade possible. The most delicate aspect of the Ghana's daily responsibilities involved managing the relationships between the empire's traditional religious practices and the growing influence of Islam among the merchant and administrative classes. While the Ghana himself remained committed to the ancestral traditions that legitimized his authority in Soninke eyes, he recognized that many of his subjects and allies had embraced the new faith brought by merchants and scholars from the north. This religious complexity required diplomatic skills as refined as those needed for international relations. The Ghana participated in traditional ceremonies while also showing respect for Islamic practices. He ensured that Muslim merchants and administrators felt secure in their religious observances while maintaining the sacred groves and ritual practices that connected him to the spiritual sources of his power. The court included both traditional priests and Islamic scholars, each group contributing their expertise to the challenges of governing a diverse empire. The physical layout of the royal compound reflected this careful balance: traditional architectural elements, courtyards designed for ceremonial gatherings, storage areas for tribute goods, workshops where court artisans created the regalia and ceremonial objects required for royal rituals occupied central positions within the complex. At the same time, newer additions accommodated the needs of Islamic administration: offices for scribes who maintained records in Arabic, reception halls designed according to Islamic principles of hospitality, and private quarters where Muslim advisors could observe their religious obligations without conflicting with traditional practices. Evening brought different responsibilities. As the heat of the day subsided and the cool breezes that made desert life tolerable began to stir, the Ghana would often receive informal reports from the network of intelligence gatherers, who kept him informed about conditions throughout the empire and beyond. Information flowed to Koumbi Saleh along the same routes that carried trade goods. Reports of weather conditions that might affect caravan travel, political developments in neighboring kingdoms, changes in market conditions that might require adjustments to tax policies, and the countless other details that determined an empire's success or failure. The Ghana's evening meals became informal councils where the day's business was reviewed and future policies discussed. Traditional Soninke foods, millet-based dishes, various meat and vegetable preparations, and the fermented beverages that marked ceremonial occasions were served alongside delicacies that reflected the empire's international connections. The conversations that accompanied these meals blended local concerns with broader strategic considerations, as the Ghana and his advisors sought to understand how events in distant places might affect their own people's welfare. As night settled over Koumbi Saleh and the two cities that made up Ghana's heart, the sounds of empire gradually faded into peaceful silence. In the merchant quarter, foreign traders counted the day's profits and planned tomorrow's negotiations. In the royal city, the Ghana reviewed reports from distant provinces and considered the complex decisions that would shape his empire's future. Across the savannah, in countless small communities that looked to Ghana for protection and leadership, families gathered around evening fires to share meals and stories, secure in the knowledge that they belonged to something larger and more powerful than themselves. The empire that Bassi had founded and his successors had expanded had become, by the 10th century, one of the most sophisticated political and economic systems in the medieval world. It had achieved this success not through military conquest alone, but through the patient development of institutions and relationships that served the interests of all who participated in its complex networks of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Yet even as Ghana reached the height of its power and prosperity, forces were already stirring in the wider world that would test the empire's strength and adaptability. in ways that its founders could never have imagined. To the north, beyond the Sahara's burning sands, new religious and political movements were gathering strength that would soon send waves of change across the entire region. To the south, other African peoples were developing their own ambitions for wealth and power, ambitions that would eventually challenge Ghana's monopoly over the gold trade that had made the empire possible. The golden age of Wagadou was approaching its zenith, but the very success that had made Ghana great would soon attract the attention of rivals, who coveted what the Soninke people had built with such patience and skill. The stars that had witnessed Dinga's first footsteps in the land of gold now looked down upon cities filled with wealth and learning, upon trade routes that connected distant continents, upon a civilization that had proven African peoples capable of creating empires as sophisticated and enduring as any in the world. But the stars also knew, as they wheeled in their ancient patterns across the desert sky, that all earthly kingdoms must face the test of time, and that even the greatest empires must eventually find ways to renew themselves or risk being swept away by the very forces of change that had once carried them to greatness. In the silence of the African night, as caravans rested and merchants dreamed of tomorrow's profits, the Empire of Ghana stood at the pinnacle of its achievement, master of the golden rivers of trade that flowed between the world's great civilizations. The wisdom of Diaby's victory over the serpent of Wagadou had borne fruit beyond anything the ancient founders could have envisioned, creating a legacy that would endure long after the last Ghana had spoken his final words and the desert winds had claimed the last ruins of Koumbi Saleh. The golden threads of prosperity wove themselves ever deeper into the fabric of Wagadou's existence, as if the very earth beneath the empire had learned to sing with the rhythm of commerce and the whispered prayers of 1,000 merchants. The reign of Ghana Bassi, which had begun with such promise in the year 1040, now stretched across more than 2 decades of unprecedented wealth and influence. In the great halls of Koumbi Saleh, where the morning light filtered through carved wooden screens and cast geometric shadows upon floors polished smooth by countless sandaled feet, the king held court with a majesty that had become legendary across the known world. The empire's reach had extended far beyond the dreams of its founders, stretching like the arms of a great baobab tree across the vast expanse of the western Sudan. From the salt mines of Tagaza in the distant north, where men labored beneath the merciless sun to extract the white gold that would travel south on the backs of camels, to the gold fields of Bambouk in the forest lands, where the precious metal was sifted from river sands and torn from the earth's hidden veins. The influence of Ghana Bassi could be felt in every transaction, every negotiation, every careful weighing of goods that would shape the destinies of nations. The king himself had grown into a figure of almost mythical proportions, his wisdom spoken of in the same breath as his wealth, his justice praised as fervently as his generosity. Foreign visitors to the capital would speak in hushed tones of the royal audience chamber, where Ghana Bassi would receive the representatives of distant kingdoms, seated upon a throne carved from a single piece of ebony and inlaid with gold, that seemed to capture and hold the light of the sun itself. Around his neck hung chains of the finest gold, and upon his arms were bracelets wrought by the most skilled artisans of the empire, each piece a testament to the sophisticated craftsmanship that had flourished under his patronage. The daily rituals of the royal court had evolved into elaborate ceremonies that reflected the empire's growing sophistication and cultural complexity. Each morning, as the first call to prayer echoed across the twin cities of Koumbi Saleh, the king would begin his day with consultations that brought together The traditional priests of the Soninke faith and the learned Islamic scholars who had increasingly found welcome in the empire's cosmopolitan atmosphere. This delicate balance between the old ways and the new had become one of Bassi's greatest achievements, a diplomatic and spiritual tightrope walk that had somehow managed to preserve the essential character of Wagadou while opening its doors to the intellectual and commercial opportunities that Islam brought in its wake. In the great marketplace of Koumbi, Saleh, where the dust never quite settled and the air shimmered with the heat of countless cooking fires and the breath of 10,000 souls, the prosperity of the empire revealed itself in all its magnificent complexity. Here, beneath awnings of woven cloth that snapped and danced in the eternal wind, merchants from every corner of the known world gathered to conduct the business that had made Ghana the envy of kings and the dream of ambitious traders from Cordoba to Cairo. The organization of this great commercial enterprise had reached a level of sophistication that would have impressed the merchants of Constantinople or the bankers of Baghdad. The royal treasury, housed in a complex of buildings near the palace, employed scribes who had mastered not only the Arabic script that had become the language of international trade, but also the traditional notation systems of the Soninke people, creating a dual system of record-keeping that ensured nothing was lost in translation and every transaction was recorded with meticulous precision. The tax system that Bassi had inherited from his predecessors had been refined and perfected into an instrument of both revenue generation and trade, regulation that struck the perfect balance between profitability and fairness. Each caravan that entered the empire's territory was met by royal officials, who assessed the value of goods with an expertise born of decades of experience, collecting the traditional duties that had made the empire wealthy while ensuring that the burden of taxation never became so onerous as to drive trade to alternative routes. The most valuable of all commodities, gold, remained under the direct control of the royal house, a monopoly that had been carefully maintained through a combination of military force, diplomatic skill, and an understanding of market dynamics that demonstrated the empire's sophisticated grasp of economic principles. Bassi himself controlled the distribution of gold nuggets, reserving the largest and most perfectly formed pieces for diplomatic gifts and royal regalia, while allowing smaller nuggets and gold dust to flow freely through the commercial networks that connected Wagadou to the wider world. The empire's monetary system had evolved beyond simple barter to encompass a complex web of exchange that included not only gold and salt, but also iron bars, copper ingots, and strings of cowrie, shells that served as currency for smaller transactions. This diversification of the monetary base had provided stability in times of fluctuation in any single commodity and had made the empire's economic system remarkably resilient in the face of external pressures. The royal workshops had become centers of innovation and artistic achievement, where master craftsmen worked under royal patronage to create objects of beauty and utility that found their way into the treasure chambers of rulers. Across North Africa and the Middle East, the goldsmiths of Koumbi Saleh had developed techniques for working the precious metal that produced jewelry and ornaments of extraordinary delicacy and beauty, while the ironworkers had perfected methods of creating weapons and tools that were prized throughout the region for their strength and durability. The wealth of Ghana flowed like a great river, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of 1,000 generations, each adding their voice to the eternal song of commerce that echoed across the endless reaches of the Sahel, within the walls of the royal palace, where the afternoon light filtered through latticed windows and painted intricate patterns. Upon floors of polished stone, a cultural renaissance had begun that would leave its mark upon the empire for generations to come. Bassi, whose reign had brought unprecedented prosperity to Wagadou, had also become a patron of learning and artistic achievement, understanding that a truly great empire must be remembered not only for its wealth, but for its contributions to the advancement of human knowledge and the beauty of human expression. The Royal Library, which had begun as a modest collection of scrolls and manuscripts, had grown into a repository of knowledge that attracted scholars from across the Islamic world and beyond. Here, in chambers cooled by the gentle movement of air through carefully designed passages, scribes and scholars worked to preserve and expand upon the accumulated wisdom of ages. The collection included not only the commercial records and legal documents that were essential to the empire's administration, but also works of poetry, philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy that reflected the intellectual curiosity of the age. The influence of Islamic learning had brought with it a new emphasis on education and scholarship that had transformed the intellectual landscape of the empire. The great mosque of Koumbi, Saleh, with its towering minaret that could be seen from miles away across the flat expanse of the Sahel, had become not only a center of worship, but also a school where young men from across the empire came to study the Quran, Islamic law, and the various sciences that had flourished under the patronage of the caliphs in Baghdad and Cordoba. Yet the traditional culture of the Soninke people had not been abandoned in this embrace of Islamic learning. Instead, a remarkable synthesis had emerged, one that honored the wisdom of the ancestors while opening new pathways for intellectual and spiritual growth. The royal court had become a place where the ancient praise singers of the Soninke tradition shared the same halls with Islamic scholars, where the traditional ceremonies that marked the passage of seasons and the celebration of harvests were performed alongside the 5 daily prayers that marked the rhythm of the Islamic day. This cultural flowering had produced a generation of artists and craftsmen whose work reflected the cosmopolitan nature of the empire and the confidence that came with prosperity and security. The textile workers of Koumbi, Saleh had developed new techniques for dyeing and weaving that produced fabrics of extraordinary beauty and durability, while the woodcarvers had created architectural elements and decorative objects that combined traditional Soninke motifs with Islamic geometric patterns in ways that seemed to capture the very essence of the empire's cultural synthesis. That the musical traditions of the empire had also evolved, as the ancient songs of the Griots, those hereditary keepers of oral history and tradition, had been enriched by the addition of new instruments and musical forms that had arrived along the trade routes from the north and east. The royal court had become a place where the sound of the kora, that ancient harp-like instrument of the Mande peoples, might be heard alongside the oud and the tambourine, creating musical experiences that reflected the empire's position at the crossroads of civilizations. The architectural legacy of this golden age could be seen in every corner of Koumbi, Saleh, where new construction projects had transformed the capital into a city that impressed visitors with its combination of grandeur and functionality. The palace complex had been expanded and embellished with courtyards and gardens that provided cool retreats from the heat of the day, while the merchant quarter had grown into a maze of streets and alleyways lined with shops and workshops that catered to every conceivable need and desire. As the year 1062 drew to its close, marked by the same seasonal rhythms that had governed life in the Sahel for countless generations, the great heart of Bassi finally stilled, bringing to an end a reign that had lasted more than 2 decades and had witnessed the empire's rise to heights of power and prosperity. that had made it the wonder of the medieval world. His death, which came peacefully in his own chambers, surrounded by the princes and nobles who had served him with such devotion, marked not only the end of an era but the beginning of a new chapter in the story of Wagadou, one that would be written by his nephew and heir Tunka Manin. The transition of power, governed by the ancient matrilineal traditions of the Soninke people, proceeded with the smooth precision that had become characteristic of the empire's political institutions. Tunka Manin, who had served as his uncle's chief advisor and had been groomed for leadership from his youth, assumed the throne, with the full support of the royal council and the blessing of both the traditional priests and the Islamic scholars, who had come to play such an important role in the empire's governance. The new king brought to his reign a combination of youthful energy and seasoned wisdom that had been shaped by years of careful observation and participation in the complex the business of ruling an empire that stretched across vast distances and encompassed diverse peoples and cultures. His coronation, which took place in the great courtyard of the palace before an assembly that included representatives from every corner of the empire and distinguished visitors from kingdoms near and far, was a ceremony that perfectly captured the empire's cultural synthesis and its position as a bridge between worlds. Under Tunka Manin's rule, the empire entered what would later be remembered as its final golden age, a period of stability and prosperity that seemed to vindicate the wisdom of the ancestors and the effectiveness of the political and economic systems that had been refined over generations of careful experimentation and adaptation. The new king proved himself to be a worthy successor to Bassi, possessing the same combination of commercial acumen, diplomatic skill, and cultural sensitivity that had made his predecessor so successful. The royal court under Tunka Manin became even more cosmopolitan and sophisticated than it had been under his predecessor, attracting scholars, merchants, and diplomats from across the known world. The king himself was described by contemporary observers as a man of remarkable intelligence and culture, equally at home discussing the finer points of Islamic theology with learned scholars or negotiating the complex details of trade agreements with the shrewdest merchants from the northern kingdoms. The empire's military strength, which had always been the foundation of its commercial success, was maintained and strengthened under the new king's leadership. The royal army, with its corps of professional soldiers armed with the finest weapons that the empire's smiths could produce, was supplemented by levies from the vassal kingdoms and by allied forces from neighboring peoples who had found it profitable to align themselves with the empire's interests. This military power was rarely displayed in open conflict, but its presence was felt in every negotiation and every diplomatic exchange that took place within the empire's sphere of influence. The administration of justice, which had been one of Bassi's greatest achievements, was further refined under Tunka Manin's rule. The king's court became renowned throughout the region for the fairness and wisdom of its decisions, and the complex legal system that had evolved to govern the empire's diverse population was administered with a skill and integrity that won the respect even of those who found themselves on the losing side of legal disputes. In the halls of power, where decisions echoed across the vastness of the Sahel, Tunka Manin held court with the wisdom of his ancestors and the vision of a man who could see the future taking shape in the patterns of the present. Yet, even as the empire basked in the golden light of its prosperity and cultural achievement, subtle changes were beginning to stir in the wider world that would eventually cast long shadows across the peaceful landscape of Wagadou. From the northern reaches of the Sahara, where the ancient caravan routes wound their way through landscapes of stone and sand, came whispers of a new movement that was gathering strength among the Berber tribes. a religious and military awakening that called itself the Almoravid movement, and that carried within it the seeds of transformation for all of North and West Africa. The Almoravids, whose name derived from the Arabic word for those who live in fortified places, had emerged from the austere monasteries and military camps of the Western Sahara as a force dedicated to the purification of Islamic practice and the expansion of the faith through conquest and conversion. Their movement had been inspired by the teachings of a Moroccan scholar named Abdullah ibn Yassin, who had preached a return to what he considered the pure and uncompromising Islam of the Prophet and the early caliphs, rejecting what he saw as the corruptions and compromises that had crept into the faith over the centuries. Under the military leadership of Yahya ibn Umar, and later his brother Abu Bakr ibn Umar, the Almoravids had begun to unite the fractious Berber tribes of the Western Sahara under the banner of religious reform and holy war. Their disciplined armies, motivated by religious fervor and hardened by the harsh realities of desert warfare, had already begun to make their presence felt along the northern edges of the trans-Saharan trade routes, where they had established a series of fortified bases that served both as centers of religious instruction and as staging points for further military expansion. The rise of the Almoravids represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power that had governed the trade routes for generations. Where the Empire of Ghana had built its success on a policy of religious tolerance and commercial openness, the Almoravids preached a more austere and uncompromising vision of Islamic society, one that viewed the syncretic religious practices and cultural compromises that had flourished in Wagadou with deep suspicion and disapproval. The first concrete sign of the Almoravid threat came in the year 1054, when their forces, moving south from their strongholds in the Atlas Mountains, seized control of the important trading city of Awdaghost, which had long been a key outpost of the Ghana Empire and a crucial link in the commercial network that connected the gold fields of the south with the markets of the north. The fall of Awdaghost sent shockwaves through the empire, not only because of the immediate economic impact of losing control of this vital trading center, but because it demonstrated that the Almoravids possessed both the military strength and the strategic vision necessary to challenge the empire's dominance of the trans-Saharan trade. The response from Koumbi Saleh was swift and determined. Tunka Manin, recognizing the gravity of the threat, mobilized the empire's military resources and dispatched armies to defend the northern frontiers and to attempt to retake the lost territories. The campaigns that followed were characterized by the fierce fighting and strategic maneuvering that had become characteristic of warfare in the Sahel. But the Almoravids proved to be formidable opponents, possessing a combination of religious motivation, military discipline, and knowledge of the terrain that made them extremely difficult to defeat in conventional warfare. The conflict with the Almoravids also revealed the extent to which the empire had become dependent on the stability and security of the trade routes that had been the foundation of its prosperity. The disruption of commerce caused by the fighting along the northern frontiers had immediate and serious consequences for the empire's economy, as caravans were forced to seek alternative routes or to delay their journeys until the situation stabilized. The royal treasury, which had grown accustomed to the steady flow of customs duties and taxes from the trans-Saharan trade, began to feel the strain of reduced revenues at the same time that military expenditures were increasing dramatically. More troubling still was the way in which the Almoravid advance had begun to affect the religious and cultural balance that had been so carefully maintained within the empire. The austere Islamic orthodoxy preached by the Almoravids found sympathetic ears among some of the empire's Muslim population, particularly among the merchant communities that had the closest ties to the broader Islamic world. These internal divisions, while not yet threatening the fundamental stability of the empire, created new tensions and uncertainties that complicated the task of governance and made it more difficult to maintain the unity of purpose that had been one of the empire's greatest strengths. As the 1070s dawned over the ancient capital of Koumbi, Saleh, the empire found itself at a crossroads that would determine not only its immediate future but its ultimate destiny. The pressure from the Almoravids had not diminished with the passage of time. If anything, it had intensified as their movement gained momentum and attracted more followers from among the Berber tribes of the Sahara and the Maghreb. The loss of Awdaghost had been only the beginning of what was clearly intended to be a much larger campaign of conquest and conversion within the empire itself. The stress of constant military preparation and the disruption of normal commercial activities had begun to take its toll on the social and economic fabric that had held Wagadou together for so many generations. The Royal Council, which had once focused primarily on the peaceful business of administration and trade regulation, now found itself wrestling with questions of military strategy and resource allocation that had no easy answers. The empire's traditional strengths, its wealth, its commercial networks, its cultural sophistication seemed less relevant in the face of an enemy that was motivated by religious conviction rather than material gain. Tunka, whose reign had begun with such promise and had seemed destined to continue the golden age initiated by his predecessor, now found himself confronting challenges that tested the very foundations of the empire's power and identity. The king's wisdom and diplomatic skills, which had served him well in the peaceful negotiations and commercial disputes that had characterized the early years of his reign, were now being tested by the harsh realities of military conflict and religious controversy. The empire's response to the Almoravid challenge revealed both its enduring strengths and its emerging vulnerabilities. The military forces that Tunka Manin was able to mobilize demonstrated the empire's continued ability to project power across vast distances and to coordinate the efforts of diverse peoples and kingdoms in pursuit of common goals. The royal army, supplemented by levies from the vassal states and allied forces from neighboring kingdoms, represented a formidable military force by the standards of the time. Yet the very nature of the conflict exposed the limitations of the empire's traditional military approach. The Almoravids, with their emphasis on mobility, religious motivation, and guerrilla tactics, represented a new kind of warfare that was ill-suited to the empire's strengths in conventional battle and siege. Warfare. The desert terrain over which much of the fighting took place favored the defenders, who knew every water source and hidden path, over the attackers, who were fighting far from their own supply bases and support networks. The economic impact of the prolonged conflict was perhaps even more serious than the immediate military challenges. The empire's prosperity had been built on the foundation of peaceful trade and stable commercial relationships, but the Almoravid threat had disrupted these relationships and forced the empire to divert resources from productive activities to military purposes. The great caravans that had once traveled the Trans-Saharan routes with confidence and regularity now faced constant threats from raiders and bandits, who took advantage of the unsettled conditions to prey upon commercial traffic. The cultural and religious tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of the empire's cosmopolitan society also began to emerge more clearly as the conflict with the Almoravids intensified. The empire's traditional policy of religious tolerance and cultural accommodation, which had been one of its greatest strengths in times of peace and prosperity, became a source of division and uncertainty when confronted with an enemy that demanded uncompromising religious conformity. Some of the empire's Muslim subjects, particularly those in the merchant communities who had the closest ties to the broader Islamic world, began to question whether the syncretic religious practices and cultural compromises that had characterized life in Wagadou were compatible with true Islamic faith. The Almoravid message of religious purity and the need to reject all forms of cultural accommodation with ne-Islamic traditions found a receptive audience among those who had always felt somewhat ambivalent about the empire's policy of religious tolerance. The traditional priests and religious leaders of the Soninke people, who had played such an important role in the empire's governance and cultural life, now found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. The growing influence of Islamic orthodoxy, encouraged by the Almoravid advance and the conversions that followed in its wake, threatened to marginalize the ancient traditions and practices that had been the foundation of Soninke identity for countless generations in the space between what had been and what was to come. The empire stood like a great tree whose roots ran deep but whose branches swayed in winds that carried the sense of distant storms and the promises of transformations yet to be revealed. The year 1076 would prove to be a watershed in the history of the empire, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The events of that year would be remembered by future generations as the moment when the old order gave way to the new, when the ancient traditions of Wagadou were forced to accommodate themselves to the demands of a changing world. The empire that had been built on the foundation of cultural synthesis and religious tolerance would be transformed by forces that demanded a more rigid conformity to Islamic orthodoxy and a rejection of the accommodations that had made peaceful coexistence possible. Yet even as these great changes swept across the landscape of West Africa, the essential character of the Soninke people and their ancient homeland remained unchanged. The skills and knowledge that had made them masters of trade and diplomacy, the wisdom that had enabled them to build and maintain one of the great empires of the medieval world, the cultural traditions that had given meaning and purpose to their lives, all of these would survive the immediate crisis and would eventually find new expressions in the transformed world that was emerging from the ashes of the old. The story of the Ghana Empire, which had begun with the legendary migration of Dinga and his people from the east, which had reached its zenith in the great trading cities and prosperous kingdoms of the Sahel, was now entering its final chapter. But the end of the empire would not mean the end of the story, for the peoples and cultures that had created Wagadou would continue to shape the destiny of West Africa long after the last of the Cis kings had passed into memory and the great city of Koumbi Saleh had been abandoned to the desert winds. In the gathering dusk of empire, as the shadows lengthened across the courtyards of the royal palace in the evening, call to prayer echoed across the twin cities of the capital. Tunka Manin continued to hold court with the dignity and wisdom that had marked his reign. The challenges that faced the empire were great, but they were not insurmountable. The people of Wagadou had faced adversity before and had emerged stronger and more united. The traditions that had sustained them through the long journey from obscurity to greatness would serve them well in the trials that lay ahead. The empire stood at the threshold of transformation, poised between the world it had known and the world it was destined to become. The choices that would be made in the months and years ahead would determine whether that transformation would be a renewal or a dissolution, whether the ancient kingdom of Wagadou would adapt to the new realities of the changing world, or would fade into the realm of memory and legend. The answer to that question lay in the hands of the people themselves, in their wisdom, their courage, and their willingness to embrace change while remaining true to the values and traditions that had made them great. Yet in this very height of prosperity, like morning mist that carries both promise and warning, new currents were stirring across the vast expanse of the Sahara. From the northern reaches of the desert, where the Atlas Mountains caught the first light of dawn, came whispers of change that would echo through the corridors of Koumbi sailed like distant thunder. The year was approaching the middle of the 11th century, and with it came forces that would reshape not only Wagadou, but the entire tapestry of West African civilization. In the great mosque of Cordoba, where learned men gathered to discuss matters of faith and philosophy, the name of Ghana had begun to appear in the writings of scholars. Al-Bakri, the Cordobon geographer, penned his observations of this distant land with the careful precision of one who understood that knowledge. Traveled slower than gold, yet lasted far longer. His quill moved across parchment in the lamplight, recording descriptions of a realm where traditional beliefs still held sway, where sacred groves surrounded the royal compound, and where the conversion to Islam remained a matter of politics, rather than conviction among the ruling class. But faith, like water seeking its level, has its own inexorable momentum. Along the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world to the heart of West Africa, more than goods were exchanged. Ideas traveled in the minds of merchants. Prayers were whispered in the evening stillness of caravanserai, and the call to prayer echoed across desert camps where Muslim traders from the north shared their evening meals with Soninke merchants from the south. In the marketplaces of Koumbi Saleh, Arabic phrases mingled with Soninke words, and the architectural influences of North African design began to appear in the newer buildings that rose within the commercial quarter of the city. The Ghana Tunka man, who would later be remembered as one of the last great rulers of the traditional era, watched these changes with the measured wisdom of one who understood that a kingdom's strength lay not in resistance to change, but in the ability to channel it. In the royal compound, traditional griots still sang the ancient stories of Dinga and the serpent Bida, their voices weaving tales that connected the present to the mythic past. Yet in the same compound, Muslim advisors now held positions of influence, their knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and law proving invaluable to the administration of an empire that stretched across vast distances and encompassed diverse peoples. The tension between tradition and transformation played out in countless small moments. The Muslim merchant, who removed his shoes before entering the presence of the Ghana, showing respect for customs that predated Islam. The Soninke noble who learned Arabic script to better conduct business with northern traders, yet still participated in the ancient rituals that honored the ancestors. The court scribe who recorded tax revenues in Arabic numerals while maintaining the oral traditions that preserved the empire's history in living memory. As the 11th century progressed, this delicate balance faced new pressures from the north. In the Sanhaja territories of the Western Sahara, a movement was taking shape that would challenge not only the religious practices of West Africa, but the very foundations of political power that had sustained Ghana for centuries. The as they would come to be known, emerged from the austere traditions of Berber Islam, their vision of religious purity as harsh and uncompromising as the desert landscape that had shaped their worldview. The founder of this movement, Abdullah ibn Yassin, was a scholar whose interpretation of Islamic law brooked no compromise with what he saw as the corruptions of worldly power. Unlike the pragmatic merchants who had gradually introduced Islam to the trading centers of West Africa, Ibn Yassin preached a return to what he believed were the pure principles of the faith. uncontaminated by political convenience or cultural accommodation. His message found fertile ground among the Sanhaja tribes, who had long chafed under what they perceived as the excessive wealth and luxury of the established trading centers in the fortress monastery of Ribbit, where the wind carved patterns in the sand and the call to prayer echoed across empty expanses. The Almoravid movement took shape with the methodical precision of a military campaign. The men who emerged from this austere environment were not merely warriors, but religious zealots, convinced that their mission was sanctified by divine will. They called themselves Almorabitan, the people of the Ribbit, and their vision extended far beyond the Sahara to encompass the entire Islamic world, from the Atlantic shores of Morocco to the trading centers of the Sudan. When Abu Bakr ibn Umar assumed leadership of the movement after Ibn Yassin's death in 1059, the Almoravids had already begun to expand their influence beyond the confines of the desert. Their first major victory came with the capture of Sejil Masa, the great trading center that controlled the northern terminus of the trans-Saharan routes. The fall of Sejil Masa sent ripples of concern throughout the trading networks that connected North and West Africa, for it demonstrated that the Almoravids were not content to remain a desert phenomenon, but intended to challenge the established order of commerce and politics in Koumbi, Saleh. The news of Sejil Masa's fall was received with the gravity appropriate to a development that threatened the very foundations of Ghana's prosperity. The Ghana Tunka Manin, whose reign had been marked by careful diplomacy and shrewd commercial policy, now faced a challenge unlike any that had confronted his predecessors. The Almoravids represented not merely a military threat, but an ideological one, challenging the religious pluralism and cultural accommodation that had allowed Ghana to function as a bridge between the Islamic world and the traditional societies of West Africa. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to the Royal Council. Ghana's wealth depended on its ability to maintain stable relationships with both the Islamic trading networks of the north and the gold-producing regions of the south. The empire's strength lay not in religious uniformity, but in its capacity to serve as a neutral ground where different faiths and cultures could interact for mutual benefit. The Almoravid vision of religious purity threatened to destroy this carefully constructed balance, potentially cutting Ghana off from either its northern trading partners or its southern sources of gold. As the Almoravid influence spread southward, from their base in Morocco, the trading post of Awdaghost became the focal point of their expansion into the Sahel. This ancient city, which had long served as a crucial link in the chain of commerce that connected the Mediterranean world to West Africa, found itself at the center of a struggle that would determine the future of the entire region. The capture of Awdaghost by the Almoravids in 1054 marked a turning point in the history of the Ghana Empire, for it demonstrated that the northern approaches to the Soninke heartland were no longer secure. The loss of Awdaghost reverberated through the empire like the tremor that precedes an earthquake. This city had been more than a trading post. It had been a symbol of Ghana's ability to project power far beyond its core territories and to maintain control over the vast network of routes that carried the lifeblood of commerce across the desert. When Almoravid forces occupied the city, they did more than capture a strategic location. They severed one of the vital arteries that had sustained the empire's prosperity for generations. In the palace of Koumbi Saleh, where the sound of fountains had long provided a peaceful counterpoint to the deliberations of the Royal Council, the mood grew somber as reports arrived from the north. Merchants who had traded regularly with Awdaghost spoke of the changes that had transformed the city under Almoravid rule. The tolerance for different religious practices that had characterized the old regime was replaced by a strict enforcement of Islamic law. The elaborate ceremonies and festivals that had marked the seasonal cycles of trade were swept away in favor of a more austere interpretation of religious observance. Yet the challenge posed by the Almoravids extended beyond immediate military or economic threats. Their ideology represented a fundamental rejection of the synthesis of cultures that had made Ghana prosperous, where the empire had thrived by allowing different peoples to maintain their distinct identities while participating in a common commercial enterprise. The Almoravids demanded religious and cultural uniformity. Their vision of Islam left no room for the kind of accommodation that had allowed traditional Soninke practices to coexist with the faith brought by Muslim traders. The pressure of this ideological challenge was felt most acutely by the Muslim community within Ghana itself. The merchants and scholars who had gradually embraced Islam found themselves caught between their loyalty to the empire that had protected and enriched them and their sympathy for a movement that claimed to represent the pure teachings of their faith. In the mosques of Koumbi, Saleh, prayers were offered with increasing fervor, but the nature of those prayers varied dramatically depending on the perspective of the worshipper. Some members of the Muslim community saw in the Almoravid movement a long overdue correction to what they perceived as the compromises and accommodations that had weakened their faith. They argued that true Islam could not coexist with the traditional practices that still flourished in the royal compound and the surrounding villages, the sacred groves where ancient rituals were performed, the festivals that celebrated the agricultural cycle according to pre-Islamic traditions, the very structure of royal authority based on divine kingship rather than Islamic principles. Of these, they claimed, were incompatible with genuine faith. Others within the Muslim community took a different view, arguing that the gradual introduction of Islam had allowed the faith to take root without destroying the social fabric that held the empire together. They pointed to the prosperity that had followed the arrival of Muslim traders, the knowledge that had been gained through contact with the Islamic world, and the peaceful coexistence that had characterized religious life in the empire's major cities. The Almoravid approach, they argued, would destroy the very foundations of Ghana's strength without offering any viable alternative. The Ghana Tunka Manin, faced with these mounting pressures, demonstrated the diplomatic skills that had characterized the best of his dynasty. Rather than rejecting Islam outright or embracing it uncritically, he sought to navigate a middle course that would preserve the empire's essential character, while acknowledging the religious currents that were reshaping the region. His court became a center of theological discussion, where Islamic scholars debated points of law and practice with the same intellectual rigor that had once been applied to questions of trade and diplomacy. The physical transformation of Koumbi, Saleh during this period reflected the broader changes taking place throughout the empire. New mosques were constructed with architectural styles that borrowed from both North African and traditional Soninke design traditions. The call to prayer became a regular feature of the city's daily rhythm, yet it coexisted with the drums and songs that marked traditional celebrations. The market squares, where goods from across the known world were bought and sold, became spaces where different cultural traditions met and mingled with increasing frequency. Yet beneath this surface accommodation, deeper tensions were building. The traditional priests who maintained the sacred groves and performed the ancient rituals began to speak more openly of their concerns about the empire's direction. They had witnessed the transformation of other societies that had fully embraced Islam, noting how traditional practices were gradually abandoned and ancient knowledge was lost. The stories of Dinga and Bida, which had provided the mythic foundation for royal authority, seemed increasingly irrelevant in a world where legitimacy was measured by adherence to Islamic principles. The younger generation of Soninke nobles, many of whom had been educated in both traditional law and Islamic scholarship, found themselves caught between worlds. They understood the practical advantages of Islamic conversion, the enhanced trading relationships, the access to new forms of knowledge, the potential for diplomatic alliances with the expanding Muslim world. Yet they also recognized what would be lost in such a transformation: the distinctive cultural identity that had sustained their people for generations, the connection to the land and ancestors that informed their deepest values, the very essence of what it meant to be Soninke. As the 1070s approached, the empire faced a crisis of identity that went far beyond questions of military strategy or economic policy. The choice between traditional ways and Islamic modernization had become a choice about the very nature of civilization itself. In the corridors of the royal palace, where the wisdom of ages was preserved in oral traditions passed down from generation to generation, debates raged about whether accommodation was possible or whether the empire must choose definitively between its past and its future. The year 1076 dawned with an ominous clarity, as if the very air had been purified by the intensity of the forces that were converging on the ancient kingdom of Wagadou. In the palace archives, where scribes had recorded the rise and fall of tributary kingdoms, the tributes paid by vassal states, and the intricate negotiations that had maintained the empire's dominance, new documents appeared that would mark this year as a turning point in the history of West Africa. The precise sequence of events that led to Ghana's conversion to Islam remains shrouded in the mists of conflicting accounts. Yet the outcome was unmistakable. Whether through military conquest, diplomatic pressure, or internal revolution, the ancient kingdom underwent a transformation that would reshape its identity for generations to come. The traditional narrative, preserved in Arabic chronicles, speaks of Almoravid armies sweeping southward to capture Koumbi Saleh and force the conversion of its rulers. Yet modern scholarship suggests a more complex reality, one in which internal pressures and external influences combined to create an irresistible momentum toward change. In the royal compound, where the sacred groves had provided a link to the ancestral spirits for countless generations, the ancient trees stood silent as witnesses to the empire's transformation. The rituals that had sanctified royal authority since the time of Dinga were performed for the last time, their words and gestures carrying the weight of centuries of tradition. The drums that had announced the Ghana's presence, the praise songs that had celebrated his divine kingship, the elaborate ceremonies that had marked the agricultural seasons, all of these would soon be memories, preserved only in the minds of those who had witnessed their final performance. The conversion of the Ghana to Islam was accompanied by a systematic transformation of the empire's governmental structure. The traditional advisors, whose authority had been based on their knowledge of ancient customs and their ability to interpret the will of the ancestors, found themselves replaced by Islamic scholars versed in the Quran and the principles of Islamic law. The royal court, which had functioned according to traditions that dated back to the empire's founding, was reorganized along lines that reflected Islamic concepts of authority and governance. Yet the transformation was not merely a matter of changing personnel or revising administrative procedures. The conversion to Islam represented a fundamental shift in the empire's relationship with the sacred, moving from a worldview that saw the divine as intimately connected to the natural world and the ancestral past to one that emphasized submission to a transcendent God whose will was revealed through scripture and interpreted by learned men. The sacred groves, where the presence of the divine had been experienced through direct communion with the natural world, were replaced by mosques where the divine was approached through the mediation of written texts and formal prayers. The impact of this transformation extended far beyond the royal court to affect every aspect of life in the empire. In the villages that dotted the countryside around Koumbi Saleh, traditional festivals were replaced by Islamic observances. The harvest celebrations that had marked the completion of the agricultural cycle were supplanted by religious holidays that followed the lunar calendar. The stories that had been told around evening fires, tales of ancient heroes and magical creatures that had provided moral guidance and cultural identity, were gradually displaced by accounts of Islamic saints and prophets in the marketplaces, where trade had long provided the foundation for the empire's prosperity. The conversion brought both opportunities and challenges. Muslim merchants from North Africa found themselves dealing with a government that now shared their faith, creating possibilities for closer commercial relationships and more favorable trading terms. Yet, the traditional trading partners from the south, many of whom continued to follow ancestral religions, found themselves increasingly alienated from an empire that had once served as a bridge between different worlds. The newly converted rulers of Ghana faced the complex task of maintaining the empire's commercial dominance while adapting to a religious system that had very different assumptions about the nature of authority and the purposes of government. Islamic law provided detailed guidance on matters of commerce, taxation, and administration. Yet its application to the specific circumstances of a West African empire required careful interpretation and adaptation. The scholars who served as advisors to the converted Ghana found themselves creating new precedents, developing forms of Islamic governance that had never before been attempted in the Sahel region. The architectural transformation of Koumbi Saleh during this period provided a visible symbol of the empire's religious conversion. The great mosque that was constructed in the heart of the city represented not merely a place of worship, but a statement about the new identity that Ghana was claiming for itself. Its minaret, rising above the traditional buildings that surrounded it, served as a beacon that could be seen from great distances, announcing to travelers and traders that this was now a city of the Islamic faith. Yet even as the empire embraced its new religious identity, the challenges of governing a diverse population in a vast territory remained unchanged. The Soninke people who formed the core of the empire's population had to be gradually introduced to Islamic practices and beliefs. The tributary peoples who provided much of the empire's wealth continued to follow their traditional religions, creating a complex situation in which the central government professed one faith while many of its subjects practiced others. The resolution of these contradictions required a pragmatic approach that balanced religious conviction with political necessity. The newly Islamic rulers of Ghana found themselves developing a form of governance that emphasized Islamic principles in matters of central importance, while allowing considerable autonomy in local affairs. This accommodation enabled the empire to maintain its territorial integrity and commercial prosperity while satisfying the religious requirements of its new faith. The educational system that emerged in the aftermath of the conversion reflected this same pragmatic approach. Islamic schools were established in the major cities, where students learned Arabic script and studied the Quran. Yet traditional forms of education continued in rural areas, where the oral traditions that preserved the empire's history and cultural identity were passed down from generation to generation. This dual system created a population that was increasingly literate in Arabic, while remaining rooted in the cultural traditions that had shaped Soninke identity for centuries. As the empire adapted to its new religious identity, the economic foundations that had sustained its prosperity faced new challenges. The gold mines that had provided the basis for Ghana's wealth were located in regions where traditional religious practices remained strong. The miners and traders who controlled these crucial resources were often suspicious of the changes taking place in the capital, fearing that Islamic conversion would disrupt the spiritual practices that they believed were essential to successful mining operations. The tension between religious transformation and economic necessity created a complex dynamic that would shape the empire's development for decades to come. The rulers of Ghana found themselves walking a delicate line, promoting Islamic observance while avoiding actions that might alienate the traditional communities whose cooperation was essential to the empire's continued prosperity. This balancing act required diplomatic skills of the highest order, as well as a deep understanding of the diverse cultural and religious traditions that existed within the empire's borders. In the decades that followed the empire's conversion to Islam, the transformed Kingdom of Ghana struggled to maintain its position in a rapidly changing world. The religious transformation that had been intended to strengthen the empire's relationships with its northern trading partners had the unintended consequence of weakening its ties to the traditional societies of the south. The delicate balance that had sustained Ghana's commercial dominance for centuries was disrupted by the very changes that had been designed to preserve it. The Almoravid movement, which had been instrumental in Ghana's conversion, continued to expand its influence throughout North and West Africa. Yet the success of this religious reform movement created new challenges for the converted empire. The Almoravids' interpretation of Islamic law was more stringent than the pragmatic approach that Ghana's rulers had adopted, leading to tensions between the empire and its northern neighbors. The very movement that had brought Islam to Ghana now criticized the empire for its compromises and accommodations. Meanwhile, the traditional sources of the empire's wealth began to shift in response to changing political and economic conditions. The gold mines that had sustained Ghana's prosperity for generations were increasingly controlled by local communities that had little loyalty to the distant capital. The trade routes that had once converged on Koumbi were gradually diverted to other centers that offered more favorable conditions for merchants. The empire that had once stood at the crossroads of the known world found itself increasingly isolated from the currents of change that were reshaping the region. The transformation of the empire's military organization reflected these broader changes. The traditional warrior societies that had provided the backbone of Ghana's armies were gradually replaced by forces organized according to Islamic principles. The new military structure emphasized discipline and religious devotion over the personal loyalty and martial traditions that had characterized the old system. While this transformation produced armies that were more uniform and disciplined, it also weakened the bonds between the central government and the local communities that had traditionally provided military service. As the 12th century dawned, the Empire of Ghana found itself facing challenges that would have been unimaginable to its earlier rulers. The rise of new political entities in the surrounding regions, the shift of trade routes away from traditional centers, and the internal tensions created by religious transformation combined to create a crisis that threatened the very foundations of Soninke power. The empire that had once seemed as permanent as the desert itself now appeared vulnerable to forces that it could neither control nor fully understand. The royal court in Koumbi led, where the converted rulers of Ghana attempted to navigate. These treacherous currents became a place of intense debate and careful calculation. The advisors who served the Ghana included both Islamic scholars versed in the principles of religious law and traditional counselors who understood the complex relationships that bound the empire together. The decisions that emerged from these deliberations reflected the difficulty of governing a diverse population in a changing world, as well as the skill required to balance competing demands and conflicting loyalties. The cultural life of the empire during this period reflected the broader tensions between tradition and transformation. The praise singers who had once celebrated the divine kingship of the Ghana adapted their art to accommodate Islamic sensibilities, creating new forms of poetry that honored the ruler's piety rather than his semi-divine status. The festivals that marked the passage of the seasons were restructured to align with Islamic observances. Yet they retained elements of the traditional celebrations that had provided community identity for generations. As the century progressed, the signs of the empire's decline became increasingly apparent to those who had eyes to see. The tribute payments from vassal states arrived less regularly and in smaller amounts. The great caravans that had once brought wealth from distant lands now often bypassed Koumbi Saleh in favor of other destinations. The imperial administrators, who had once governed far-flung territories with confident authority, found their commands increasingly ignored or challenged by local rulers who no longer feared the Ghana's displeasure. Yet the empire's decline was not simply a matter of political or economic weakness. The spiritual transformation that had been intended to revitalize Ghana had instead created a crisis of identity that affected every aspect of society. The traditional beliefs and practices that had provided meaning and purpose for generations had been officially abandoned. Yet the Islamic faith that had replaced them remained alien. To many of the empire's subjects, this spiritual vacuum created a sense of rootlessness and uncertainty that undermined the social cohesion that had been the empire's greatest strength. In the villages that dotted the countryside around the capital, the effects of this identity crisis were perhaps most visible. The elders who had been the guardians of traditional knowledge found themselves marginalized by the new Islamic order, their wisdom dismissed as ignorant superstition. The young people who might have learned the old ways were instead sent to Islamic schools where they studied Arabic and memorized passages from the Quran. The result was a generation that was neither fully rooted in traditional culture nor completely comfortable with the Islamic faith that had been imposed upon them. The economic consequences of this social transformation were profound. The traditional craft industries that had sustained local communities for generations began to decline as the knowledge and skills required for their practice were no longer passed down from parents to children. The agricultural techniques that had been refined over centuries were gradually forgotten as attention shifted to the religious obligations that were deemed more important than worldly concerns. The empire that had once been renowned for its prosperity and stability found itself struggling to maintain even basic levels of economic activity. As the empire weakened, its neighbors began to assert their own ambitions. The Soso people, who had long been subject to Ghana's authority, began to organize themselves into a confederation that challenged the empire's traditional dominance. To the east, the Mali kingdom was beginning to emerge as a significant power, its rulers demonstrating the same combination of military skill and commercial acumen that had once made Ghana the master of the region. The empire that had once dominated the entire western Sudan found itself increasingly confined to its core territories around Koumbi Saleh. The rulers of Ghana, faced with these mounting challenges, attempted to revitalize their empire through a series of reforms and initiatives. New mosques were constructed to demonstrate the empire's commitment to Islam. Trade agreements were negotiated with northern partners to restore commercial relationships. Military campaigns were launched to reassert imperial authority over rebellious vassals. Yet these efforts, while sometimes successful in the short term, could not address the fundamental problems that had created the crisis in the first place. The transformation of the empire's capital during this period reflected the broader changes taking place throughout Ghana. Koumbi, Saleh, which had once been a vibrant center of international commerce and cultural exchange, began to show signs of decline. The great marketplace that had attracted merchants from across the known world saw fewer and fewer trading caravans. The residential districts where wealthy merchants and imperial officials had maintained their households became less densely populated as prosperity shifted to other centers. The city that had once embodied the empire's power and wealth was becoming a symbol of its decline and transformation. As night fell over the ancient capital, the call to prayer echoed across streets that had once resounded with the languages of a dozen different peoples. In the mosques where the faithful gathered for evening prayers, the words of the Quran were recited in Arabic, yet the hearts of many worshippers remained with the ancestors whose graves lay beneath the sacred groves that still surrounded the city. The Empire of Ghana was learning that transformation, even when embraced willingly, could exact a price that was higher than anyone had anticipated, and that the future, however promising it might appear, could never fully compensate for the irretrievable loss of the past. The conversion brought with it not merely new prayers and new customs, but new divisions that cut through the heart of the empire like a blade through silk. In the royal quarters of Koumbi, Saleh, where once the sacred groves had whispered with ancestral voices, now stood structures of stone and wood dedicated to a faith born in distant deserts. The Ghana found himself caught between worlds, custodian of ancient traditions that his people had followed since time immemorial, and leader of a realm increasingly shaped by the rigid certainties of Islamic law. The decades following the conversion witnessed a gradual but inexorable transformation of Wagadou's very soul. Where once the empire's strength had derived from its unity, Soninke traditions binding together diverse peoples under the sacred authority of the Ghanan, now there emerged competing sources of legitimacy. Islamic scholars, many of them recent converts themselves, began to question practices that had sustained the empire for centuries. The royal ceremonies that had once awed visiting merchants and envoys with their displays of ancient regalia and invocations of ancestral spirits now seemed relics of a discredited past to those who had embraced the new faith with the fervor of the converted trade. Once the empire's greatest source of strength began to reflect these internal tensions, Muslim merchants, emboldened by their shared faith with the ruler, demanded preferences in taxation and legal disputes. The careful balance that had allowed Wagadou to prosper for so long, its ability to serve as neutral ground where diverse peoples could meet and exchange goods regardless of their beliefs, started to tilt. Some of the empire's oldest trading partners, particularly those who remained faithful to traditional African religions, began to seek alternative routes that bypassed Koumbi, Saleh altogether. The Ghana's own household became a microcosm of these broader tensions. His wives, some of whom had converted while others maintained their ancestral beliefs, found themselves navigating an increasingly complex social landscape. The children of the royal house grew up bilingual not merely in Soninke and Arabic, but in two entirely different ways of understanding the world. Some embraced Islamic learning with passionate dedication, studying the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence with scholars who had traveled from distant lands. Others clung to the old ways, learning the secret names of spirits and the proper rituals for ensuring the rains came in their season. Perhaps most troubling of all was the gradual erosion of the empire's military might. The Soninke had always been formidable warriors, their strength deriving not just from individual skill but from their deep sense of collective purpose. They fought not merely for gold or territory, but for Wagadou itself, for the sacred land that their ancestors had carved from the wilderness through courage and wisdom. But as the old certainties dissolved, so too did the warrior spirit that had made the empire's armies feared throughout West Africa. Young men who might once have dedicated themselves to the warrior's path now found themselves torn between different models of masculinity and honor. Islamic tradition spoke of jihad and the spiritual rewards of fighting for the faith. But this was a different kind of warfare than what their fathers had known. The complex rituals that had once prepared Soninke warriors for battle, the consultations with spirit mediums, the sacred oaths sworn in the presence of ancestral shrines, now seemed not merely old-fashioned but potentially blasphemous to those who had embraced the new faith. The empire's administrative structure, too, began to show signs of strain. The traditional system of governance had relied heavily on personal relationships and oral agreements, sealed by ceremonies that invoked both human and spiritual witnesses. But Islamic law demanded written contracts, standardized procedures, and courts that operated according to principles derived from the Quran and Hadith rather than local custom. The transition was neither swift nor smooth, and in the gaps between old and new systems, corruption and inefficiency began to flourish. Regional governors, once bound to the Ghana by ties of kinship and sacred obligation, began to assert greater independence. Some cited Islamic principles to justify their resistance to certain royal edicts, while others claimed that new religious obligations took precedence over their traditional duties to the crown. The careful web of relationships that had held the empire together for centuries began to fray, thread by thread. It was during this period of internal weakness that external enemies began to take notice. The Almoravids, flush with their victories in North Africa and Spain, cast their gaze southward toward the gold-rich lands beyond the desert. But they were not the only ones watching Wagadou's struggles with interest. To the south and east, other peoples who had long been subjects or tributaries of the Ghana Empire began to contemplate the possibility of independence. Among these was a people called the So, inhabitants of the mountainous regions to the southeast of Koumbi Saleh, led by a king named Sumanguru. The Soso had 4 generations paid tribute to the Ghana, providing iron tools and weapons in exchange for protection and trading privileges. But Sumanguru was a man of different caliber than his predecessors, ambitious, ruthless, and possessed of a keen understanding of Wagadou's growing vulnerabilities. Sumanguru himself remained faithful to the traditional religions of his ancestors, and he watched with calculating eyes as the Ghana Empire tore itself apart over questions of faith. Where the rulers of Wagadou saw religious conversion as a path to greater prosperity and stronger ties with wealthy Muslim trading partners, Sumanguru saw an opportunity. The empire that had once seemed as permanent as the stars was revealing itself to be as fragile as morning mist. The Soso king began his campaign not with open warfare, but with careful diplomacy and strategic alliances. He reached out to other traditional chiefs and kings who chafed under Wagadou's rule, particularly those who had been alienated by the empire's conversion to Islam. His message was simple but powerful. The Ghana had abandoned the ways of their ancestors and thereby forfeited their right to rule over peoples who remained faithful to the old gods. While Sumanguru built his network of allies, the Ghana Empire continued to weaken from within. The conversion to Islam, rather than bringing the stability and prosperity that its architects had promised, had instead opened new fault lines in Ouagadou's social fabric. Muslim merchants, confident in their shared faith with the rulers, began to demand not just trading privileges, but active participation in governance. They pushed for the implementation of Islamic commercial law, which would have fundamentally altered the trading relationships that had made the empire prosperous. At the same time, those who remained faithful to traditional African religions felt increasingly marginalized and oppressed. Some were forced to practice their beliefs in secret, gathering in hidden groves far from the watching eyes of Islamic authorities. Others simply abandoned their ancestral lands altogether, migrating to regions where they could worship as their fathers had done, without fear of persecution or social ostracism. The royal court itself became a place of whispered conspiracies and shifting loyalties. Islamic scholars vied with traditional priests for influence over the Ghana, while different factions of the royal family plotted to position themselves for succession according to their preferred interpretation of legitimacy. Some argued for strict adherence to traditional matrilineal inheritance, while others suggested that Islamic principles should govern the selection of the next ruler. These internal divisions made Ouagadou increasingly vulnerable to external pressure. When Almoravid raiders began making incursions into the empire's northern territories, the response was sluggish and uncoordinated. Local commanders, uncertain whether they should follow traditional military protocols or newly introduced Islamic rules of warfare, hesitated at crucial moments. The famous Soninke cavalry, once the terror of West Africa, found itself divided between those who maintained traditional battle rituals and those who had adopted Islamic prayers and customs. The first major blow came in 1054, when the succeeded in capturing Awdaghost, one of Ouagadou's most important trading centers. The loss was both economic and symbolic. It demonstrated that the Ghana Empire was no longer capable of protecting its own territories, let alone projecting power beyond its borders. More importantly, it disrupted crucial trade routes and deprived the empire of significant tax revenue at a time when it desperately needed resources to address internal challenges. News of Awdaghost's fall spread throughout West Africa like wildfire, and everywhere it sparked the same question: if the mighty Ghana could not hold one of its own major cities, what did this mean for the empire's future? Tributary states began to delay their payments, testing whether Ouagadou still had the will and ability to enforce its authority. Some simply stopped paying altogether, calculating that the empire was too weak to retaliate effectively. Soumangru watched these developments with the patience of a hunter awaiting the perfect moment to strike. He continued to build his coalition of allies, promising them that, under his leadership, they would enjoy the prosperity and security that the Ghana Empire could no longer provide. His arguments carried particular weight, because he could point to concrete evidence of Ouagadou's decline: the loss of Awdaghost, the internal religious conflicts, the obvious discord within the royal court itself. The Soso king also began to modernize his own military forces, incorporating lessons learned from observing both Almoravid tactics and the evolving nature of West African warfare. He invested heavily in iron weapons and imported horses, gradually building an army that could challenge even the famed Sonic warriors on equal terms. But perhaps more importantly, he maintained the unity and morale that the Ghana Empire had lost. His soldiers fought not just for personal gain or territorial conquest, but for a vision of African independence from both Islamic conversion and foreign domination. The end. when it came, was swifter than anyone had anticipated. In 1203, after years of careful preparation and strategic maneuvering, Sumanguru launched his final campaign against the Ghana Empire. His forces moved with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm, striking at multiple points along Wagadou's extended frontiers before converging on Koumbi, Saleh itself. The defenders of the ancient capital found themselves facing not just military defeat, but the collapse of everything they had believed about their world. The city that had stood for centuries as a symbol of African power and prosperity was surrounded by enemies who spoke their own languages and worshipped their own gods. The elaborate trade networks that had made Koumbi Saleh the jewel of West Africa crumbled as merchants fled and caravans sought safer routes through territories controlled by Sumanguru's allies. Within the royal palace, the Ghana and his advisors debated their limited options. Some counseled negotiation, arguing that Sumanguru might be willing to allow the empire to continue as a tributary state under Soso protection. Others insisted on fighting to the end, maintaining that the dignity of Wagadou demanded no less than total resistance to foreign conquest. Still others suggested that the royal family should flee to distant territories, where they might establish a new kingdom and eventually return to reclaim their ancestral lands. But these debates proved academic, for Sumanguru had no intention of allowing the Ghana Empire to survive in any form. He understood that as long as the ancient dynasty remained intact, it would serve as a rallying point for those who opposed his rule. The conquest of Koumbi Saleh was therefore not merely a military victory, but a deliberate act of political annihilation designed to erase Wagadou from the map forever. When the city finally fell, Sumanguru's forces showed little mercy to those who had resisted them. The royal family was scattered or killed, the ancient palaces were burned, and the sacred groves where generations of Ghanas had communed with their ancestors were cut down and desecrated. The great mosque that had symbolized the empire's conversion to Islam was destroyed as thoroughly as the traditional shrines. For Sumanguru viewed both as symbols of foreign influence that had weakened authentic African civilization. The conquest of Koumbi Saleh marked the effective end of the Ghana Empire. But the story of West African civilization was far from over. Even as Sumanguru celebrated his victory, forces were already stirring that would eventually challenge his own power. To the south, a young prince named Sundiata was gathering allies and resources for what would become the Mali Empire, an even greater power than Wagadou had ever been. But the immediate aftermath of Ghana's fall was a period of chaos and uncertainty throughout the region. The trade routes that had brought prosperity to West Africa for centuries were disrupted, causing economic hardship from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River. Many of the skilled craftsmen, scholars, and merchants who had made their homes in Koumbi Saleh scattered to distant lands, carrying with them the knowledge and techniques that had made the Ghana Empire great, but depriving the region of their expertise and experience. Sumanguru's triumph proved to be his harsh rule and his destruction of the very trade networks that had made the region prosperous created resentment among the same peoples who had initially welcomed him as a liberator from Ghana's declining authority. Moreover, his military victories had been bought at the price of enormous expenditure in men and resources, leaving his own kingdom weakened and vulnerable to new challenges. It was this vulnerability that Sundiata and his allies exploited when they launched their own campaign for control of West Africa. The Battle of Kirana, fought around 1235, saw the end of Soso power and the beginning of Mali's long dominance over the region. Sumanguru himself disappeared from history, becoming in turn the subject of legends that portrayed him as a powerful, but ultimately doomed figure who had overreached in his ambitions. The rise of Mali represented both continuity and change in West African history. Like Ghana before it, Mali derived its wealth and power primarily from control over trade routes and gold production. The new empire's rulers understood the importance of accommodating diverse religious and cultural traditions while maintaining political unity and military strength. But Mali was also different from its predecessor in crucial ways: larger, more centralized, and more thoroughly integrated into the broader Islamic world. Under Mali's rule, some of the former territories of the Ghana Empire experienced a renaissance of sorts. The great trading cities flourished once again as caravans resumed their journeys across the Sahara, bringing salt from the north and carrying gold, ivory, and slaves to markets in North Africa and beyond. New centers of learning emerged, where scholars from throughout the Islamic world gathered to study and teach, creating intellectual networks that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. But Koumbi Saleh itself never recovered from Sumangru's conquest. The ancient capital, once the heart of a mighty empire, gradually faded into insignificance as trade and political power shifted to newer centers. The ruins of its palaces and mosques were slowly reclaimed by the desert, covered by the shifting sands that eventually hide all human ambitions. By the 15th century, the city was largely abandoned, its exact location forgotten by all but a few elderly storytellers, who preserved memories of its former glory in oral traditions passed down through generations. The legacy of the Ghana Empire could not be so easily buried beneath the desert sands. Throughout West Africa, the memory of Wagadou lived on in the songs of Griots, the traditional praisingers and historians who served as the living repositories of African history. These skilled artists carried with them not just the names and deeds of ancient kings, but the deeper truths about what the empire had represented: the possibility of African greatness, the power that came from unity and wise leadership, the wealth that could be created through peaceful trade and cultural exchange. In the centuries that followed Ghana's fall, these oral traditions took on an almost mythical quality. The empire's greatest rulers became legendary figures, their achievements magnified by the natural tendency of memory to emphasize glory while forgetting mundane details. Dinga, the founder, was remembered as a figure of almost supernatural wisdom and power. The various Ghanas who had ruled during the empire's golden age were portrayed as paragons of justice and prosperity, rulers whose very presence had guaranteed peace and abundance throughout their domains. But perhaps more importantly, the Ghana Empire's example influenced the thinking of later African leaders and intellectuals. The memory of Wagadou served as proof that Africans were capable of creating and maintaining sophisticated political institutions, complex economic systems, and vibrant cultural traditions. This knowledge provided both inspiration and practical guidance for those who sought to build new forms of African unity and prosperity in later centuries. The empire's approach to religious and cultural diversity also left lasting marks on West African civilization. The Ghana's traditional policy of tolerance and accommodation, which had allowed peoples of different faiths and customs to coexist peacefully within the empire, became a model that later rulers attempted to emulate. Even after the region's conversion to Islam, the memory of Wagadou's inclusive approach influenced the development of uniquely African forms of Islamic practice that incorporated elements of traditional religion and culture. Trade patterns established During the Ghana Empire's heyday continued to shape West African development long after the empire itself had vanished. The routes pioneered by sonic merchants became the foundations for later commercial networks, while the techniques and standards they had developed for evaluating gold, salt, and other commodities influenced trading practices throughout the region. The Ghana Empire's emphasis on taxation and regulation of trade also provided a template that later empires adapted to their own circumstances. Archaeological evidence of the empire's existence began to emerge only in the 20th century, as European and African scholars started systematic excavations at sites like Koumbi, Saleh. These investigations revealed the sophisticated material culture that had flourished under Ghana's rule: fine pottery, elaborate metalwork, evidence of complex urban planning and architecture. The physical remains confirmed what oral traditions had long maintained, that medieval West Africa had been home to civilizations of remarkable sophistication and achievement. The very name, Ghana, took on new significance in the 20th century, when the British colony of the Gold Coast chose to adopt it. Upon achieving independence in 1957, this decision reflected the new nation's desire to connect with its pre-colonial African heritage and to assert its identity as part of a continuous tradition of African greatness. Although the modern nation of Ghana has no direct political or cultural connection to the ancient empire, the symbolic link represents the enduring power of historical memory in shaping contemporary African identity. Modern historians and archaeologists continue to study the Ghana Empire, seeking to understand not just what happened during its rise and fall, but what its story reveals about the broader patterns of African history. Some focus on economic factors, analyzing how control over trade, routes and natural resources shaped political development. Others examine social and cultural questions, investigating how the empire's diverse populations maintained their distinct identities while participating in a larger political unit. Religious scholars studied the empire's conversion to Islam as an example of how world religions adapt to local conditions and how local traditions influence the development of universal faiths. Political scientists analyze Ghana's governmental structures for insights into how pre-colonial African societies organized themselves and maintained stability across vast territories and diverse populations. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Ghana Empire lies not in what scholars can learn from studying its remains, but in what it represents about human possibility and achievement. For nearly 4 centuries, Wagadou stood as proof that ordinary people, working together under wise leadership, could create something extraordinary. The empire's merchants, farmers, craftsmen, soldiers, and rulers had built a civilization that brought prosperity and security to millions while fostering cultural exchange and intellectual development across a vast region. The fact that this achievement was ultimately temporary does not diminish its significance. All human institutions are temporary. All empires eventually fall. All civilizations eventually fade into memory. What matters is not the duration of Ghana's power, but the fact that it existed at all, that it demonstrated what was possible when Africans controlled their own destiny and worked together toward common goals. In the end, the Ghana Empire's greatest victory was not military or economic, but cultural and spiritual. It proved that Africa was not a continent of isolated tribes and petty kingdoms, but a place where great civilizations could flourish. It showed that Africans were not passive recipients of outside influence, but active creators of sophisticated political, economic, and cultural systems. It demonstrated that the history of Africa was not a tale of backwardness and decline, but a story of human achievement worthy of study and celebration. The desert winds still blow across the places where Koumbi sailor once stood, carrying with them grains of sand that may have witnessed the glory of the Ghana Empire. In the silence of the Sahel, where acacia trees cast thin shadows on the ancient earth, time moves with the patience of geological ages, covering and uncovering the traces of human ambition with equal indifference. Yet beneath the sand and silence, something endures. Not the gold that once filled royal treasuries, not the ivory that adorned palace walls, not even the names carved in stone monuments that have long since crumbled into dust. What remains is something less tangible but more permanent, the knowledge that here, in this landscape that seems so empty and forgotten, human beings once created something magnificent. The caravans no longer cross these paths, their bells silent, their camels turned to other routes. The great markets where merchants from distant lands once gathered to exchange goods and stories have been reclaimed by the desert. The palaces where kings once held court have become indistinguishable from the surrounding earth. But the wind remembers, and the stars that guided ancient travelers still shine with the same light that once blessed the empire of Wagadou. In the songs of Griots, in the memories preserved by elders, in the archaeological fragments slowly emerging from the sand, the Ghana Empire lives on. Not as history frozen in amber, but as living proof of what was possible then and might be possible again. The empire's true treasure was never the gold that filled its coffers, but the example it set that ordinary people, guided by wisdom and united in purpose, could build something that would outlast their own brief lives and continue to inspire generations yet unborn. The silence of the desert is not empty, but full of echoes. In the whisper of wind through ancient ruins, in the play of sunlight on weathered stone, in the patient endurance of the land itself, the spirit of Wagadou continues. What they built may have fallen, but its echo still walks the wind, reminding us that empires of the heart and mind can outlast any kingdom of stone and gold. Thank you for journeying through history with us. If these ancient stories have touched your soul and brought you peace, please consider subscribing to Fall Asleep to History. Like and share this journey through time, and help these timeless tales reach others who seek the gentle embrace of historical wisdom before sleep. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive in the modern world.